Proponents of a new system can convince their audience only by first winning their intellectual sympathy for a doctrine they have not yet grasped. Well, today, speakers such as me are very fortunate because here is an audience who, because of intellectual sympathy, have grasped the doctrine of the Sasquatch as grade A. And indeed, as Blandy said, those who listen sympathetically will discover for themselves what they would otherwise never have understood. And we have been through this process. We have listened sympathetically, we have read sympathetically the work of John Green and a few others, and we have discovered something that I, for one, would never have understood otherwise. And this process, he says, produces disciples forming a school, the members of which are separated for the time being by a logical gap from those outside it. I believe we are such a school as that. And we also, I'm sure everyone here can say, give an example of feeling separated from those outside it who have a different point of view. I'm going to change they here to we because we are that school. We think differently, speak a different language, live in a different world, and at least one of the two schools is excluded, rightly or wrongly, from the community of science. Well, I have an example of that because I have a colleague, he's actually a plant ecologist. He's very sympathetic to the idea of the Sasquatch being existing. He's here in British Columbia, but he says he's a skeptic. I think he's actually agnostic. He's quite open-minded. But he gives talks on food plants that humans eat. And he said, of course, many of these could be eaten by the Sasquatch, if it exists. So he gives this talk, and every time he says the word Sasquatch, he said, if it exists. Well, in our conversations, I don't hear people talking about the Sasquatch if it exists. We have this commonality, so we can skip that, you know. We do speak a different language. And I guess in some ways, we live in a different world, a world where the Sasquatch does exist. But the point being, at the end here, rightly or wrongly, a group such as this, such as us, is excluded from the larger community of science. Blandy goes on talking about another dispute, two other theories. He said, talking about these disputes more closely, it appears that the two sides do not accept the same facts as facts, or still less the same evidence as evidence. And this is kind of interesting because we are a member of that one school. Oh, now, what is that evidence? Well, here is some of that evidence. Those who do not accept this wonderful display of physical evidence for the Sasquatch, this display of plaster casts and track photos, say the other side said, we don't accept that evidence because it's been countered by photographs such as this, claims such as this, that all those tracks are a hoax. So they brought forward tracks like this, but we're saying, no, that's not evidence that real tracks are hoax. This is evidence that the tracks fabricated by hoaxers bear no resemblance to real tracks. Look at the square toes. And look at, in this case, the square heel. So, what is this evidence for? It's considered evidence to prove that Sasquatch tracks are hoax, yet we see it quite differently. And as Blandy says, indeed, one side may disregard some of the evidence altogether in the confident expectation that it will somehow turn out to be false. And I guess many people are convinced that in fact the tracks have been proven to be false. The film, the Patterson-Gimlin film, because of some counterclaims, have also been, concluded by many people to be hoaxed. I'd like to move on to another philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, considered the father of philosophy of science, writing in 1970. And Kuhn talked about paradigms, and I think many of you know that the current paradigm for the Bigfoot is basically something that doesn't exist. If you believe that, you probably also believe in Bigfoot. Comments like that. And that, of course, is a paradigm we would like to change. We would like to introduce a new paradigm, the Sasquatch, as existing. So Kuhn said, but if a new paradigm is ever to triumph, it must first gain some first supporters, men and women who will develop it to the point where hard-headed arguments can be produced and multiplied. And here, of course, we're referring to John Green. First supporters, people working almost in isolation, pretty much in isolation, first supporters, develop it to the point where other people, such as Jeff Meldrum, myself, many others, investigators here, come along, and we can actually work with that and hopefully improve on it. And as he says here, and even those arguments, when they come, are not initially decisive. Well, John Green could probably say, yes, tell me about it. You know, how many years has John Green been making these arguments? They haven't been decisive. They're still not decisive. However, Kuhn is somewhat hopeful. He says, but because scientists are reasonable men and women, one or another argument will ultimately persuade many of them. And I guess to some extent we all choose our favorite argument. For me as a wildlife biologist, it's a number of things, but certainly tracks are very, very important. Others might choose, say, well, we're on the edge of having DNA proof. Maybe that's going to be the argument that is decisive in persuading them. According to Kuhn, there is no single argument that can or should persuade them all. Rather than a single group conversion, what occurs is an increasing shift in the distribution of professional allegiances. And there's some evidence that this, in fact, is occurring amongst our scientific colleagues. And again, I think Jeff can comment on this better than I. Whoops. No, that's right. And he talks about people like ourselves who try to improve upon and develop the hypothesis. If we are competent, we will improve it, explore its possibilities, and show what it would be like to belong to the community guided by it. And I'm quite honored to belong to a community like this. What is it like to belong to a community guided by this new paradigm? It's wonderful. And there's all this support, there's all this interest, there's all this affirmation, without which it can be very difficult to proceed. And all the more credit to John Green for working without such a large community like this, for working sometimes with one, two, sometimes no real supporters. That's right. Now here he says, this process. As that goes on, if the paradigm is one destined to win its fight, the number and strength of the persuasive arguments in its favor will increase. This interests me because he talks about its fight, and people talk about that there's been this fight or conflict or debate, the Sasquatch debate. And many people, it seems to me, have concluded that the debate has happened and we've lost. And I keep asking, gee, I would like to contribute to this debate. When did it take place? Perhaps I was away. Perhaps I was but so many people act as if there's been a debate and it's over. And this is kind of important. George Kitson Clark, a Cambridge historian, wrote in his book, The Critical Historian, says that when a conflict is over, historians are too inclined to take the case for one side and all its partisan stories straight into the canon of history without looking at the evidence or trying to find out what the other side may have had to say. And this is what seems to have happened. We keep seeing this writing of people who write that, no, this subject is finished. And I'm saying, wait, we haven't yet got a chance to present our side. But now, in favor of the process, Kuhn says, as that goes on, if the paradigm is destined to win its fight, the number and strength of persuasive arguments in its favor will increase. But we know that eventually it will prevail. In which case, gradually, according to him, the number of experiments, articles, and books based on the paradigm will multiply. Well, that is certainly happening. That's good. Still more men and women convinced of the new view's fruitfulness will adopt the new mode of practicing normal science until at last only a few holdouts remain. This word fruitfulness is pretty important. The attributes of a good hypothesis include its testability, simplicity, and its fruitfulness, which is something like predictiveness. And if we subscribe to the great ape hypothesis that the Sasquatch is a North American large primate, we can say that, okay, if you see an animal walking across a clearing, you're getting a good look at it, it's walking on two legs, it's upright, it's huge, hair covered, walking with long swinging arms, a short thick neck. If you know that it's a Sasquatch, the hypothesis is fruitful because if you got closer, you could anticipate that it will also have a flat nose, deep-set eyes, brow ridges, and a rounded chin. Then this is what the hypothesis does. And also that if you're camped in that area at night, you might expect to hear loud vocalizations or see some evidence of projectile throwing. Now, let's move on to our last person we want to talk about here, legal scholar Cass Sunstein. And Sunstein was very helpful in many ways because he put names to some of the aspects that the philosophers talked about, such as reputational cascade. In a reputational cascade,